doing, folks? Welcome back to the Dash of Élan. Got another video for you. This time, a combat example, a new series I'll be doing that'll explore various sets of rules and give you all kinds of examples of play. In this case, we're looking at Rommel. We're going to do a combat example. Basically, some Germans have crossed a river and the Americans are counterattacking to try and force them back. We're going to give a detailed example of how it is resolved and all the mechanics involved. So if you're new to Rommel, I hope this will be interesting and useful for you in learning the game. So let's sit back, relax, and check out this example of combat in the Rommel rules. All right, in this detailed combat example of the Rommel rules, what we have here is we have two companies of Fallschirmjäger. They have the straw-colored bases. Managed to get across the river. They used boats in the previous turn. Supporting them is a Stug company or an assault gun company. Now, the assault guns that had crossed through the bridge, as you could just barely see it in the picture there, closest to the picture. In a previous turn, they fought a combat, and all three companies of Germans were forced back to retreat, and therefore they are tipped currently. It is the Americans' turn, and they've quickly decided to counterattack these troops. They have two companies of armored infantry supported by an M4 Sherman company. So let's see if the Americans can finish off these Germans and force them back across that stream. Let's jump into the example. All right, folks, let's look at this combat and give you an idea how it works in Rommel. The Americans, they are the attacker. They are the active player. They moved into the German-held space. The Germans are the defenders, the passive player. Now, basically how this works is both players will start off by calculating the combat value of each unit in the combat. The Americans have 3 units, the Germans 3. The Americans have 2 units of motorized infantry and a Sherman. They're going against 2 Fallschirmjäger units and a Stug unit. Now, usually the stats for these, you can have them showing on the bases themselves with little tabs or whatever, or markers or dice or whatever. Or you can have roster sheets like I'm using currently. And this is the values we're after right here. Basically, each column represents if they've taken any hits. The first value is a 4 for the Sherman, followed by a 3, followed by a 2. Now, if they're fresh, haven't taken any hits, it's 4. When they take their first hit, it'll drop to 3. When they take their next hit, it'll drop to 2. So you see how that works. It's kind of reminiscent of Blücher, Sam Mustapha's other set of rules for Napoleonics. Kind of works the same way as Élan in this case. All the units involved in this combat are considered fresh. They haven't taken any damage. And let's total them up. So the American motorized infantry are 4s each. So let's put some dice up here to show that. And the Sherman as well is a 4. So there's the combat values of each unit. Now for the Germans, they are also 4s for the Fallschirmjäger. And the Stug battalion, or unit, is also 4. And that's what it looks like. It's pretty even Steven there at the moment. 12 on 12 combat value. By the way, this combat here in this space, this is an open space. There is no terrain interfering with the combat or helping the defender, actually. Now, the next thing we want to do is determine if there's any modifiers. In this case, if a unit, and again, this is checked by unit, not for one side, but each unit on that side will check independently of the others. First thing to determine is if any of the units are vulnerable. And if they are, their combat value will be halved. Now here's a list on the play sheet of the 4 instances that a unit will have its combat value. Armor and non-open, attacking across a bridge, attacking while low on supply, and finally, unit is tipped. Now this last one does apply because all the German units, each of them, is tipped. Each unit will thus 1/2 its combat value. So their 4s become 2s. That's not a 6. There you go. 2. So suddenly there's a 2-to-1 advantage for the Americans in this case. Now, no matter how many of those modifiers apply, you only half it once. Now, the bonuses would come from tactics or events that you play, and we'll get into that in a bit. And basically, how that works is it doubles the combat value of the unit concerned. And regardless of how many apply, it's only doubled once. So it's just like vulnerability. As one of those modifiers applies, you only half it once. If both apply, where a unit doubles its dice and is also vulnerable in halves, they cross each other out. So the combat value wouldn't change in that case. Just keep in mind, this is checked per unit. Each unit checks whether or not it is vulnerable or has a bonus, and its combat value independently may change. Now, of course, these are all totaled for each side once this is all done. For instance, the Americans have 12 currently, and the Germans have 6. So those totals will be used to determine casualties later on in the combat sequence. However, the next thing we have to do is determine if there's a tank battle. Now, in this case, there won't be a tank battle, but I'll go through it real quick. Basically, if each side has at least one tank involved in the combat, both sides, both players, will determine which of their tanks, if they have more than one, is the leading tank. Those two opposing leading tanks will compare their armor ratings, and if one side has an advantage, a higher armor rating, it will cause an extra hit come casualty time, as long as his side causes at least one casualty from the normal combat. So it's a little bonus hit that you cause on the enemy's tank. Now, that hit, of course, would have to be applied to the opponent, to the opposing leading tank. It's not spread to other units involved in the combat. Once that's done, you figure out the normal casualties and distribute them normally. But in this case, both tanks have the same armor value. Now, just to go over this real quick, the Sherman has an armor value of 4, or 3 rather, sorry. The Stug has 2 armor values, a 4/3. And what that means is that whenever it attacks, the first number will be 4. It'll have an armor rating of 4. But if it's defending, like in this case, it uses the second value, which is 3 in this case. So comparing both armor values, they're both 3, so there is no tank battle. There won't be any extra hits caused on the opponent. So we can safely ignore. So the next thing we want to do is, starting with the Americans, the attacker, the active player, and this will be followed by the defender. But first, the American determines if he's going to include a barrage in this combat. Now, if this element that these units are part of, if he has artillery in this element that he's from, that's within range, he can call it in. And you determine this for each unit involved. So that will tell you right away that the most barrage you can get in here is 1 barrage per unit, which would be 3, because that's the max. In this case, all 3 of these Americans are in the same element, and this element they belong to has 1 artillery battalion available to come in and throw a barrage in, and that's the M7 Priest. It is in range. It's 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces away from this combat space, and it has a barrage strength of 3. Because it's part of this element, they can be called in by any of these units and add its barrage strength to the combat. So suddenly their 12 becomes 15. So now the Americans are gaining even more advantage over the Germans. At this point, the Germans get the opportunity to do so. However, in this circumstance here, Germans have no artillery. They do have Nebelwerfers, but they can only be used when the Germans are attacking. They can't be used to support a defense. The Germans here are defending, so they can't call in any Nebelwerfers. Now, when an artillery unit does support an attack by throwing in its barrage, it will be tipped as a result. In other words, it's pointing towards a corner. Can't do any more after that. So this is the case. The next step, once the players can see the values, what they are at this point, they go to their command posts and secretly determine if they're going to choose any tactics. to apply to this specific combat. So we're going to look at that next. Okay, let's take a look at the command posts for both sides. We've got the Germans and the Americans here. Let's start with the Americans. Take a look at the command post and see what it's all about. Now, here's your ops file. This is where you put your ops that you currently have available. The Americans currently have 5 ops available. They're going to use them to do various things in the game, such as put them on events during the events segment of the turn, or use them in combats if they're the defender or the attacker. You can choose tactics in here, and you choose them by putting an op on the appropriate tactic that you're going to use. There's also general tactics down here in green that you can use if you're the attacker or the defender. In this case, the Americans are the attacker. They're going to look at the offensive tactics category. Let's zoom in a little bit there. Let's see if we can check some of these out. Now, I'm not going to go overboard at this. We're going to keep this really simple. I'll take 1 or 2 tactics that'll help the Americans out in this attack. I don't expect the Germans to try and withdraw. There is a tactic that defenders can choose called withdraw, which pulls them back from the combat, avoiding casualties. I don't think they're going to do that. They want to stick where they are and hold that position across the river. So I'm not anticipating that. So one thing I want to do is choose this tactic. Now it's called massed target. If there are 3 defending units, which there are, double the barrage value of 1 artillery unit. I have 1 artillery unit barraging in this combat. If you remember, it's the M7. It has a barrage of 3. This tactic will double it. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to choose massed target. So the barrage strength of my M7 goes from 3 to 6 in this case, because the Germans are a massed target. So that's a good tactic. One thing I want to point out right away is that when you're placing these tactics, be sure to put the dice with the 1 facing up. That helps you remember which tactics, when there's a bunch on here that you've chosen from previous combats, are currently involved with the current combat. So anything with a 1 is the current combat. And like I said, that's to avoid confusion. All the others are going to be flipped to 6s, the ones that are from previous combats. Flip them to 6 once it's been resolved. The only limits you have as to the number of ops you can use for tactics, basically the number of tactics you can choose for a combat, is that each friendly unit involved in the combat allows you 1 tactic. So the max is 3 units in a space, 3 unit attackers, so 3 tactics max. If you only had 1 unit, it would only be 1 tactic. Outside of that, the only other limit you have towards the number of tactics you can choose is the number of ops you have in your op file. Another thing to note, I'll mention this, is that once you play an op on a tactic, it stays here. It stays here until you reset your command post, which is done at the beginning of each of your turns during the operations phase. That's how your ops get depleted quite rapidly. So keep that in mind. That's the reason why we flip these to 1 or 6 if it's a previous combat. So we're going to put this on 1 to show that it applies in this combat. Now, that's good enough. I don't think we have to spend any more. I really want to conserve my ops. So we're just going to take 1 tactic, mass target. That'll double the barrage strength of my M7. Now, let's see what the Germans do. And over here we have the German command post. You can see right away they only have 4 ops. And again, I don't want to go overboard with this. It's important to note that unless the defender decides to retreat his units or he gets wiped out with massive casualties, he's going to remain in that space and the attacker will have to retreat. So I'm going to feel pretty confident with that the Germans are going to hold out. Even if they take a lot of casualties, I'm going to keep my troops there because we want that position. Let's look at our defensive tactics. Again, I don't want to go overboard with these. I'm already at a big disadvantage, but I'm not too worried. So let's look at these. Panzerfaust, 1 infantry unit, doubles its combat value if at least 1 enemy armor unit is attacking. So one of my infantry units, and I have two Fallschirmjäger, and there's at least 1 armor unit that I'm fighting, which is that Sherman, I could take this tactic, and that sounds like a good one. So let's put an op down here with the 1 up. So that's going to double that infantry unit's combat value. Now, if you remember, the Germans are vulnerable, which means their dice are halved. This doubles it. So remember, when there's a double and a half at the same time, they cross out. So the net effect of this is that there'll be no modifier at all to the combat value of one of my infantry units. It's basically going to stay at what it started with, 4 combat value. And that's good enough for me. We're going to keep that and not go any further with this. So let's get back to the table and apply these 2 modifiers to the combat and resolve the combat. Now it's when both players simultaneously reveal the tactics they chose and apply them as modifiers to the combat values, or shifts. In some cases, some of the tactics are shifts. We'll get to that in a second. In the case of the Americans, they took massed attack, which doubles an artillery barrage. Here's 3, so that becomes 6. Its barrage strength is doubled. Germans took Panzerfaust, which doubles one of the infantry unit's combat values. So this 2 would become 4. Now we come with 2 totals here. In the case of the Germans, they have a total of 8. Let's show it like that. In the case of the Americans, their total is 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. So let's flip these to 3 6s to get a nice 18 as a little reminder. So I don't forget, those are the totals. Now, both sides, once they apply those modifiers, are going to roll a d6. We'll start with the Americans. And they're going to refer to this on a chart, which tells us which column for casualty allocation we use. Now, this is where we determine how many casualties we have. I'll show you that chart right here. This is the combat grid, as it's called. Each player will roll a d6, indicating which column they will use. Each of these yellow boxes represents a hit on the enemy. What you do is you roll the d6, let's say I rolled a 6, and then you look up the column to find your current combat value. Let's say my combat value was 8. So I go all the way up here. I have to equal or be less than that total. There it is right there, 8. And the number of boxes, including the 8 that are under this, is the number of hits. So 8, and then the 4, and then the 1. So it's 3 total hits scored on the enemy. They would be applied to the enemy. And the enemy would do the same thing. He'd roll d6, find his column, so on and so forth. Keep in mind, there is a second batch of modifiers that modifies which column you use. And that's where shifts kick in. And there's basically 4 of them here. Flanking the enemy, that's where you're attacking from another opposite direction or something similar to that. Flanking attack. The next one is multiple elements involved. It's a bad thing. If you've got units in the combat from different elements, you're going to be penalized with a downshift. Attacking in versus infantry in urban, mountain, or bocage, defending infantry in this terrain is going to cause a negative shift on the attacker, as you can see. And then tank shock. One side is all armor, and the other side has no armor whatsoever, no tanks. They will be penalized, the side without the tanks, the downshift. And that's how it works, my friends. So let's start this off and roll up for the Americans. Now again, the Americans' total is 18, which is pretty high. They're going to roll a d6. There's no modifiers for shifts here, the Americans. None of these modifiers apply in this case. It's open terrain. Both sides have tanks. 1 element per side. There's no multiple elements involved. And flanking enemy doesn't apply. The Americans attacked across 1 space side. So there's no modifiers for the Americans. And nor will there be for the Germans. So let's look this up. We have 5, and we're looking for 18. All the way up here, there's 17. Any higher would be no good, so we're going to take the 17. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 hits are applied to the Germans. So let's do that. Once again, there's 4 casualties going to be applied. Now, hits are applied evenly across all targets. There is a priority list I'll read that real quick for you. You can find this on page 49 of the rules. First, if the enemy scored an extra hit because of an armor advantage, that has to do with the tank battle. There isn't one here. After that, a unit that is still fresh must take a hit before a unit that is worn. Worn means you've taken at least one hit. Once that's done, the next priority is the player may not take a second step loss on a unit until all units in the combat have taken at least one. He may not take a third step loss on a unit until all his units in the combat have taken two. And those are the priorities. So in this case, no units have taken losses, or hits rather. They're all fresh. So I'm going to put one hit here. And I'm going to use little dice pods for this. I'll use green for the Fallschirmjäger, or the Germans. And I'll put one hit on each of these units. So that accounts for 3 of those 4. I got one additional hit. Now, by the way, these hits are distributed by the owning player, the German player in this case. And he'll put a final hit on, say, this unit of infantry. So this unit will be flipped to 2. And again, I'm using little dice pods that have values on them. That shows me how many hits they've taken so far. So there we go. This unit took 2 hits, this unit took 1, and this unit took 1. Now the Americans. Let's get back to the die rolling again here and see how well the Germans do. They're going to roll a d6, and they're going to reference a combat value of 8. Let's do this. And they got a 3. Look at our chart. We're going to look for 3, and we're going to find the combat value of 8, which is, let's see, 7. Can't go to 11, so it's just 7. 1 yellow box right there. They do 1 hit. Now let's get back over here, and we'll see that all these units are fresh. There are no worn, so the American player can put this hit on any unit he wants. And he's going to put it on one of the infantry, right here in the center. So all the casualties have been inflicted. Now we go to retreating. All right, now we're going to take a look at retreats. Now, one thing to keep in mind with retreating, it can be up to 2 spaces in total length, minimum of 1. Also, the attacker always retreats as long as there's at least 1 enemy defending unit remaining in the square. Hence, we start off with the defenders. And this is interesting because retreating for the defending side is always by choice. In this case, it's up to the German player to decide if he wants to retreat any or all of his units involved in the combat. By choice, in this case, he wants to make sure that he leaves troops in that space. He doesn't want to give it up too quick. He wants the Americans to fall back. But he does want to withdraw, retreat, 1 unit, this one here, because it's taken 2 hits so far, and that's not good. And he's going to retreat into this soft ground space. And also he remains tipped. Being tipped does not prevent you from retreating. It also forces you to become tipped if you're not tipped, like these Americans. We'll get to that. So he's done. He retreated 1 unit. He has 2 units remaining in the space. And that, of course, means that the Americans have to retreat. Now, for the attackers, their retreat path, the first space they retreat into has to be from the space they entered the combat space from. Now, these 2 infantry came from this space, and this Sherman came from this space over here, which is adjacent by corner. So let's start with the tank. Its first retreat will be to here. It's not mandatory to go 2 spaces, but it is an option. If it chooses to move a full 2 spaces with its retreat, its second space that it enters or retreats into cannot be adjacent to the space where the combat took place. He couldn't do this, go here and then here, because this would be adjacent. He could, however, fall back to, say, this over here or this one back here, because that ending space would not be adjacent. So he's going to retreat to this space. He has to, and he doesn't want to go a further space in his retreat. He is now tipped and thus vulnerable in combat. Now, the other 2 American motorized infantry companies, these units, they came into the attack from this space where the bridge is. We do have a guy here. Move him up out of the way. they have to retreat into this space, and they're going to remain in this space. One is enough, and they are tipped as well. Turn them sideways, facing the corner. They're done. They have retreated. So that's the end of the combat. The Germans have held the position. One unit has withdrawn. They are all tipped. The American units that engaged all retreated. They are tipped as well. This is important because you can continue with another tactical phase where we repeat this. Units will move, and even if units had just fought, they can move and continue the attack. However, if you're tipped, like in the case of these guys here, for retreating, they can't move in the tactical phase, but other units could. For instance, this unit which is not tipped, if the Americans decide to do another tactical phase, by spending OPs, they could move this guy into this space, say via this bridge area, and attack. And that would be another combat. So you can see how waves are quite effective in this game when you're making attacks like this. But that's not the case. This is one tactical phase we just played. That's how you calculate casualties, combat values, and so on and so forth. So there you go, folks. That was my combat example, the first one for Rommel that I've done for you guys. So I hope it was helpful, hope it was useful, maybe even a little bit entertaining. But there it is. Leave me some comments and some feedback on this video. Do you want to see me do more videos, combat examples of various other sets of rules, or for Rommel? Let me know and I'll see what I can do. Like, share, subscribe, and all that goodness. And as always, folks, hang in there. It's only going to get better. Take care.